There is a woman sitting across from me at a dinner table. She is 54 years old. She has kind eyes. She barely speaks. But every person at that table, without knowing why, keeps glancing at her, like they're waiting for her permission to feel something. And she never asked for that power. She never chased it. She doesn't even fully understand it yet. But it's there, radiating, quietly unmistakable. I want to tell you what's happening inside her, because once you understand it, you're going to look at your entire life differently. Most people spend their whole lives chasing influence. They buy the books, they take the courses, they study the body language, the negotiation tactics, the leadership frameworks, and they remain, fundamentally, forgettable. But there is a specific kind of person, one who is never trying to be powerful, one who spent decades being dismissed, drained, and underestimated, who becomes, almost without realizing it, the most psychologically formidable human in any room they enter. And the transformation doesn't begin at 20, it doesn't happen at 30, it doesn't even fully arrive at 40. It crystallizes somewhere in the wreckage of midlife, and what it produces is something most people never see coming. I've spent years studying behavioral psychology, human influence, and what actually separates people who merely survive from people who, over time, become genuinely untouchable. And the single most underestimated transformation I've ever encountered isn't the CEO who climbed the corporate ladder. It isn't the athlete who trained for a decade. It's the empath who finally stopped running from themselves. Stay locked in, because I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens inside the mind and psychology of an empath as they move through the second half of life. Why the very things that made them bleed in their younger years become the exact instruments of their extraordinary power later, and why the world never sees them coming until it's too late. Here's the first thing you need to understand about empaths, and most people get this wrong right from the start. Empaths are not weak. They were never weak. What they were, for most of their early lives, was misconfigured. Not broken, misconfigured. Like a military-grade computer running the wrong software. All that processing power, all that perceptive bandwidth being used for the wrong output. And the world sensed that processing power, the way predators always sense something valuable and took advantage of it, relentlessly and without guilt. An empath at 22 walks into a room and immediately feels the tension between the couple in the corner, senses the anxiety radiating off the man at the bar, notices the micro-expression of fear on the face of the woman who just smiled at her boss. They absorb it all, every bit of it, without a filter, without a firewall. And they spend the rest of the day carrying what doesn't belong to them, wondering why they feel exhausted from a night they were supposed to enjoy. This is the defining wound of early empath life. Not that they feel too much, but that they haven't yet learned what to do with what they feel. The signal is extraordinary. The system to process it hasn't been built yet. Carl Jung, who spent his entire career mapping the architecture of the human psyche, identified something crucial about this. He described what he called the feeling function, an orientation toward the world built around emotional attunement, relational depth, and sensitivity to others. And he noticed that certain people led almost exclusively through this function in the first half of their lives. Absorbing, giving, sacrificing, pouring themselves out like water from a jug that never seemed to run dry. But Jung also noticed something else. Something that the people in the middle of it rarely saw because they were too close to it. He noticed they were storing data. Every single interaction, every betrayal, every manipulation, every moment of being used or misread or taken for granted, none of it was actually lost. It was being filed, archived, cataloged at a level of emotional precision that most people aren't even capable of accessing. And that archive, that decade upon decade of human intelligence gathered not through observation, but through direct experience, that was building towards something. Something that wouldn't be visible for years, sometimes decades. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting. And I want you to pay close attention here because this next piece rewires how you see emotional sensitivity forever. Jung described what he called the inferior function, Now stay with me because this is where the real psychology lives. In psychology, the inferior function isn't your weakness in the ordinary sense. It's the capacity you suppressed. The part of yourself you learned to distrust, to downplay, to hide, because at some point life punished you for it or told you it wasn't safe. For empaths, the inferior function is almost always the thinking function. Logic, strategy, detachment. The capacity to assess a situation coldly, to draw conclusions without emotional interference, to say something is wrong without feeling guilty for noticing. Young empaths suppress this function. They push it into what Jung called the shadow, the psychological basement where everything we don't want to look at gets stored. They suppress it because they were taught that cold logic and deep feeling can't coexist. They suppress it because every time they started to think strategically, someone made them feel heartless. So they chose warmth over clarity, connection over discernment. And they paid for that choice repeatedly, in relationships that drained them, in people they carried who never carried them back, in situations they stayed in far too long because leaving felt cruel. But Jung understood something that nobody around them understood. He understood that you cannot suppress a function forever. The psyche doesn't allow it. What gets buried doesn't disappear. It builds pressure. And eventually, in the second half of life, it surfaces. Not as an explosion, not as a breakdown, as an integration. And when an empath's emotional intelligence, that lifetime of accumulated human data, merges with a newly activated thinking function, the result is something so psychologically powerful that most people around them can't even fully articulate what they're witnessing. They just feel it. They just know, somehow, not to try certain things with this person anymore. Let me make this concrete, because abstract psychology only goes so far. Imagine a woman who spent her 20s and 30s as the person everyone called when their world fell apart. She was the one who answered at 2 a.m. She was the one who canceled her own plans to show up for someone else's crisis. She was the one who, in every relationship, loved more, gave more, forgave more, and got less. She was told she was too sensitive, too emotional, too much. So she became quieter about what she felt and louder about helping others feel better. Now imagine that same woman at 52. She's been through 2 significant betrayals, the kind that don't just hurt you, but fundamentally change how you see the world. She's been through a relationship that slowly dismantled her sense of self. She's been through the long, grinding work of rebuilding. And somewhere in that rebuilding, something shifted. She stopped explaining herself to people who had already decided who she was. She stopped showing up for people who were never available when she was the one who needed showing up for. She stopped making herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes from having been through enough to finally know the difference between what matters and what's just noise. She still feels everything, don't misunderstand that. The sensitivity didn't go anywhere. But it's no longer running unmanaged. It's running through a filter built from every experience she survived. And what comes out the other side isn't raw emotion anymore. It's something closer to radar. High precision, hard-won, bone-deep human intelligence. This is what Jung called individuation. And for empaths, it's not a gentle process. It's a complete psychological restructuring. It's the moment when the self that was built to please others begins to dissolve, and the self that actually exists underneath, the real one, the complete one, begins to take its place. Here's something else Jung discovered that I want you to sit with for a moment. He identified a principle he called enantiodromia. It comes from an ancient Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, and it refers to the idea that things, when pushed far enough in one direction, eventually and inevitably reverse into their opposite. Heat turns to cold. Day turns to night. The person who spent a lifetime saying yes, when they finally reach their limit, becomes the person whose no is absolute. Jung saw this happening in real time in the lives of the people he worked with. And he noticed that empaths experienced this principle more dramatically than almost anyone else, because they had been pushed further in one direction than almost anyone else. The empath who forgave everything eventually becomes the one whose forgiveness must be earned and is not guaranteed. The empath who always had time for everyone eventually becomes the one who guards their time with a quiet, unmovable resolve. The empath who was the emotional anchor for every room they entered eventually becomes the one who requires emotional reciprocity before they'll invest anything real. And the fascinating thing, the thing that makes watching this transformation almost viscerally striking, is that it doesn't look like anger. It doesn't look like bitterness or resentment or the closing off of a person who's been hurt too many times. It looks like calm, like a kind of gravitational solidity, like a person who has arrived somewhere deep inside themselves and set down their bags for the last time. People who encounter an empath who has undergone this transformation often describe the same experience without knowing each other. They say things like, "I don't know what it is about her, but I just can't lie to her." Or, "I tried to play games and somehow I felt like he already knew." Or, "There's something about being around them that makes me want to be more honest." That isn't magic. That's the result of someone who has processed more human behavior, more emotional complexity, more psychological data than most people encounter in a lifetime, and integrated it into a coherent, unshakable internal framework. They see the lie before it forms because they've felt that particular emotional signature dozens of times before. They sense the shift before it happens because their body has been tracking these patterns for decades. They understand the wound behind the behavior because they remember when they had the same wound and wore it the same way. This is what Jung called earned wisdom, not knowledge acquired from books, not techniques practiced in front of a mirror, something that can only be forged by living through enough, feeling through enough, and surviving enough to build a map of human nature that most people never have access to. Now, I want to address something directly, because if you're an empath who has spent years questioning whether your sensitivity is a flaw, if you've been told you're too emotional, too deep, too intense, I want you to hear this clearly. The sensitivity is not the problem. The sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was that it was operating without the support structure it needs, without boundaries, without discernment, without the strategic clarity that comes from integrating your thinking function. Without those things, sensitivity becomes a liability, something that bleeds you dry and leaves you confused about why the people you gave everything to never seem to understand what that cost you. But with those things, with the full integration that only time and experience can produce, that same sensitivity becomes something else entirely. It becomes a precision instrument. It becomes the thing that makes you the most difficult person in the world to deceive, the most effective person in the world at understanding what's actually happening beneath the surface of a conversation, the most genuinely powerful presence in any room, not because you're demanding attention, but because you're reading everything that everyone else is missing. There's a reason that across cultures and throughout history, the people sought out for genuine counsel, the people trusted with the most important decisions, the people described as having some kind of deep, hard-to-define wisdom, were almost never the loudest people in the room. They were almost always the ones who had lived the most, felt the most, processed the most, and come out the other side not harder, but more distilled. You know what distillation actually is? It's the process of applying heat to something, pressure, difficulty, intensity, until everything impure burns away and only the most essential elements remain. That is what midlife does to an empath who has the courage to keep going, to keep feeling, to keep processing instead of numbing out. It burns away the performance. It burns away the need for approval. It burns away the compulsive self-sacrifice that was never generosity. It was fear dressed up as kindness. And what remains after that burning is something that is completely, irreducibly real. Carl Jung wrote that the greatest tragedy isn't growing old. The greatest tragedy is growing old without becoming conscious. And what I've come to understand through years of studying human psychology and behavior is that empaths who survive the second half of life aren't just becoming conscious. They're becoming awake in a way that most people never experience because most people never went deep enough in the first place to have anything real to wake up from. The person who felt everything and was destroyed by it becomes the person who feels everything and is directed by it. That is the transformation. That is what nobody around them predicted. That is what nobody prepared for, least of all the empath themselves. So let me describe what this actually looks like in practice, in a way that I think will resonate deeply if you're somewhere on this path. At some point, and you will know exactly what point I'm talking about if it's already happened, The empath stops arguing, not because they've given up and not because they have nothing left to say, but because they have finally understood something profound. The right people don't need an argument, and the wrong people won't hear one, no matter how perfectly constructed it is. So the energy stops going into convincing and starts going into discernment, into identifying, with a speed and accuracy built from decades of experience, who falls into which category. At some point, the empath stops showing up to prove themselves. They stop trying to demonstrate their value to people who have already decided they're disposable. They stop the performance of worthiness, not because they become cold, because they finally understood at a cellular level that their worth was never up for negotiation. It never required demonstration. It was always there, running underneath all the frantic effort to make other people see it. At some point, the empath's presence changes. People can feel it before they can articulate it. Something in the room is different when this person enters. Not loud, not dominant, not aggressive, but certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to announce itself because it doesn't need validation from outside. The kind of certainty that only comes from having walked through fire repeatedly and discovered each time that you're still standing. And here's the thing that I find most extraordinary about all of it. The empath who reaches this point, the one who has integrated their shadow, who has activated their thinking function, who has completed the long, painful, essential work of individuation, they don't become less compassionate. They become more precisely compassionate. They have the capacity to feel the full weight of another person's pain and simultaneously maintain the clarity to not be consumed by it. To hold space for someone without disappearing into that space. To give from a place of genuine abundance rather than from a frantic fear of what happens if they stop giving. This is the version of an empath that the world doesn't see coming. This is the version that has no blueprint in popular culture, no archetype in the movies, no reference point in the conversations people have about sensitivity and emotional intelligence. Because it doesn't fit any of the familiar categories. It's not the wounded healer. It's not the burned-out giver. It's not the bitter person who closed themselves off to protect what was left. It's something that doesn't have a clean label because it's genuinely rare. It's a person who is fully alive, who feels everything without being destroyed by anything, who understands people at a depth that took decades to develop and cannot be shortcut, who has learned through the only curriculum that teaches this particular lesson, the curriculum of real experience, real loss, real betrayal, and real rebuilding, who has learned exactly what they are worth, and exactly what they are willing to do with the time they have left. They are not diminished by age. They are refined by it. They are not quieter because they have less to say. They are quieter because they have finally learned that speaking only when it matters is one of the most powerful things a human being can do. They are not slower because they have lost their urgency. They are slower because they understand, with a certainty that only experience can provide, that the right timing is everything, and that rushing is almost always a form of anxiety masquerading as productivity. And if you are somewhere in the middle of this process, if you are in the part that feels like burning rather than refining, if you are in the part where the old version of you is clearly not working anymore and the new version hasn't fully arrived yet, I want to tell you something that I believe with complete conviction. What you are going through is not a breakdown. It is a necessary architectural revision of a structure that was never designed to hold the full weight of who you actually are. And what comes out the other side, if you have the courage to feel it instead of running from it, if you have the discipline to process it instead of numbing it, if you have the patience to trust that the becoming is worth the burning, what comes out the other side is the most powerful version of a human being I have ever encountered in any field of study. Not powerful in the way that word is usually used. Not loud, not dominant, not aggressive, not positioned. Powerful in the ancient sense of the word. Powerful the way a deep river is powerful. Not because it crashes and roars, but because nothing can stop where it's going. That woman at the dinner table, the one with the kind eyes and the quiet presence, the one everyone keeps glancing at without knowing why, she is not performing anything. She has nothing left to prove and no one left to perform for. She arrived, finally, at herself. And that arrival is so rare and so complete and so unmistakably real that every other person in the room can feel it. This is what time does to an empath who does not give up. This is what Jung understood about the second half of life, what most people miss entirely, and what I believe is one of the most important things any sensitive person can hear when they're in the middle of wondering whether all of it, all the feeling, all the suffering, all the carrying and giving and losing and rebuilding, was worth it. It is not just worth it.
It is the whole point.